Yoga is not acrobatics, it's not aerobics, it's not a workout or a good stretch, it's not a competition, and it's not a comparison of one's being to anybody else or even to our own selves. Yoga is a process of coming into yog. And in Sanskrit, yog means a union. And it's the union of the body, mind, and spirit, and the union of the individual being to a whole being. And tapping into this wholeness allows us to tap into the deep wisdom that lies within ourselves and expanded beyond ourselves. I want to acknowledge in doing this work around cultural appropriation and yoga that there's been many, many people before me and alongside me that are doing this work, and I'm by no means the only person doing it. So often I think of the question, how can yoga be taught? And I come back to this time where I was staying in an ashram in India, learning more about yogic medicine and this 5,000-year-old spiritual path. And it comes to me that yoga cannot be taught because yoga is a process that one must go through. And while I was at this ashram, this person who was a Swami, but of course didn't tell anybody he was just leading our course or program while we were staying there. And he affirmed many times over, he came in and said, I'm not a yoga teacher. None of you are yoga teachers or instructors. You cannot teach yoga. So I think coming into the practice, whether a practitioner or someone who shares this path or medicine, we must be humble enough to know that we don't know as much as we think we do, and also that we have much to offer in just being present with each other. Yoga has been turned into something completely opposite of that in a North American and capitalist context. And that's a result of cultural appropriation. And so yoga has been turned into something that's diluted of its original meaning. It's been turned into a plaything. It's been turned into entertainment. It's been fetishized as something exotic or something attainable, something that can be held. And that's actually very counter to a yogic philosophy that to renounce possession or to look at how we are attached to worldly things. So the context of yoga that I'm speaking of comes from South Asia and from India, and is a 5,000-year-old medicine and spiritual path. But we can see many similar practices that are like yoga that have existed around the world in other places that have also been colonized. So in North and East Africa, there's Kemetic yoga, and we can see similar traditions here on Turtle Island, also known as North America, and even in South America and Peru, for example, that echo similar philosophy and medicine systems that are like yoga. There are many people around the world who have been trying to talk about cultural appropriation for centuries. Indigenous people and Black people, especially here on Turtle Island, have had to deal with the bulk of cultural appropriation and extraction from their cultures and have been doing a lot of work to address this. So it's not unique to yoga or South Asia that this is happening. Cultural appropriation is taking a symbol or a cultural practice out of its original space or context and then plunking it down somewhere else, and it becomes devoid of its original meaning. And in the process, the people who are doing the extraction often are benefiting, whether through personal gain, financial gain, or entertainment. On one hand, colonization and racism allow for a demonizing or criticizing of Hindu, Vedic, or yogic practices. But on the other hand, it can be pedestaled and it can be considered magic and exotic, which is not an honoring of its wholeness. When we fetishize something, it becomes a very thin version or diluted version of what it actually is. The roots of cultural appropriation come from a 500-year legacy of colonization that has lent itself to racism that's pervasive in our society and capitalism, and out from there birthed cultural appropriation. We have to also recognize that we're all living in a world after 500 years of colonization that continues as we are here today on Turtle Island, and Indigenous peoples here have been working with settlers being here for that long as well. Folks from European countries went around the world and took over land through violent means. So through genocide, through murder, through rape, through forced conversion to Christianity often. And if not, then you would lose your land or your people or be killed. The reaction to spiritual and cultural practices of where they were going was that these practices were savage, primitive, and a derogatory kind of magic. They were destroyed and severed in many ways. They were suppressed. And so to practice these paths on spiritual journeys was often risky or forbidden. This happened in the case of Hindu and Vedic teachings, and in South Asian, along with Buddhist and Jain and Sikh teachings and Islamic teachings as well. While there was a suppression of these cultural and spiritual practices, there was still resilience and they survived. In the mid-1800s, while the British Raj was in power in the South Asian continent, we can see that yoga was starting to be brought over to the West, but it was under the rule of colonizers and a white dominance. And they had already told the people of India that their practices were savage and primitive. And so it was through control that they were able to take it out the way they wanted. It was like extracting a resource that they could sell as something exotic. And again, a plaything or entertainment or a new way of looking at spirituality that was actually 5,000 years old. We can see how colonization has also led to capitalism as an extraction of resources from other people or services from other people, and that other folks benefit from it, and that everything becomes commodified or sellable. In my play, Yoga Cannibal, the tagline was enlightenment for a price. And so the idea of everyone wanting a quick fix, and that's how yoga is sold now. When we look at how racism leads to cultural appropriation, it ties directly back to colonization. What's pervasive in our society is that the colonized culture has turned into the dominant culture, which is a white, Eurocentric or Western-centric way of being. And so that has been decided that that's the standard and that is the norm. And everything else is considered other to that or in comparison to this white norm. That includes spiritual practices and cultural practices. When we look at spaces that are considered yoga spaces in North America, there's often an idea or image of who belongs there. And through marketing, which is a result of capitalism, we can see that white, skinny-bodied women who are cisgendered women are on the marketing campaigns or that we might see on internet searches or magazines of who is supposed to be practicing yoga. This also plays out in terms of people who are from South Asia or people of color or indigenous people and how they have access to traditional spiritual paths or medicines. So if there's been a severing that has happened through colonization and we're asked to move towards a white norm, then there's also an internal struggle in accessing our own medicines and our own spiritual practices. When we see people in spaces who might wear a tika or a bindi around the Agnya chakra, which is considered the chakra of wisdom, third eye of wisdom. For me, growing up, or even now, if myself or my mother is to wear a bindi, we get treated a certain way on the street. We can get spat at. That has happened to me. So to connect to the Agnya chakra comes with a lot of pain to overcome the racist behavior that people have perpetrated towards us. Also, when we see folks chanting Sanskrit or witnessing white people wearing Indian clothing, they're able to do all of that without having to deal with the repercussions of racist behavior and reaction. If I were to wear Indian clothing or speak in Hindi or Sanskrit, I would be treated a certain way. So there's a privilege in being able to practice and wear certain clothing without having to deal with the violence that comes with that if you're a person of color. On a big macro level, who benefits? We can see corporations benefiting from yogic medicine and practice by turning it into something that's sellable. So there are yoga accessories, there are yoga mats, there are yoga towels, there is yoga clothing, there are whole fashion lines based on yoga. And are they really coming from a place that is traditionally supportive of a yogic practice? And if yogic practice is not necessarily about our exterior physical being, but has been turned into that, then are we moving away from a yogic practice? Small studios and spaces that share yoga and individual businesses also benefit financially by selling yoga as a commodity that can be bought by spending way too much money. It's often close to $20, $25 to attend a class, or as I like to think of them, sessions. And also, in addition to this, they end up being elevated as experts on yoga in the world. There have been times where I have shared yoga in these spaces that are considered studio spaces, and often I try not to, unless there's very specific events or occasions that feel right regarding my spiritual practice and political way of being in the world. And on the occasions that I have taught in those spaces, I've gotten congratulations as if it was an accomplishment to be practicing in these mainstream spaces. So the fact that I have been trying to counter that is not considered valuable as much as it is to work within a framework that has public visibility that is attached to commerce and economics and making money from it. We can also see this rippling into people individually being considered experts in the field of yoga or the industry of yoga. And so this can be really harmful in that people who are not from this culture being the face of what yoga is now. And again, excluding people from feeling welcome or feeling like it's been stolen from them because the experts no longer look like them. And at the same time, we have to be careful not to tokenize. So it's not just always an Indian brown person talking about it, and that there's actual relationship building happening. We also, as individuals, benefit from a yogic practice. People who do go further into the study of yoga beyond the physical form as it's taught in yoga studios here in North America for the most part, people who go on that path start to have go on a spiritual journey perhaps, or look at their own mind and body, and these teachings might change their relationships in the workplace, in the home, with families, with friends, with communities. So people are benefiting without giving acknowledgement to where the teachings come from, or sometimes without even acknowledging that the teachings aren't new, that in fact they are 5,000 years old. So ultimately, I really feel that this kind of yogic practice that is based on consumption, capitalism, this Western industry model of yoga doesn't really benefit anybody in the larger picture. It's actually harmful to our beings because it focuses on the physical body without acknowledging the many paths or parts of the path involved in yoga. And it's a half knowledge. So with half knowledge, you can hurt yourself actually a lot more. And in addition to this, to practice with the exclusion of people who are brown, black, people of color, indigenous people, people with different physical abilities, people who are not skinny, people who don't fit into this gender binary of man and woman, who often aren't included in these spaces, actually becomes more harmful to people who are included even in that mainstream bubble, because you're then practicing in isolation without an understanding of the world and the inequalities and injustices that exist in the material world. Tanis Nielsen is an Indigenous artist and academic who is prolific and fun and brilliant. And she did a workshop with myself and a collective I'm a part of called R3, Roots, Rhythm, and Resistance, started by Amai Kuda, and along with other 13 members who do work around decolonization through art and spirit practice. And so Tanis was helping us in a journey of looking how colonization shows up within our practices as well. So it's important that we're always doing the self-reflection work, which is just as much a part of a yogic path as doing physical asanas. The 5 steps of colonization that Tanis Nielsen broke down for us were 1, denial, 2, destruction, 3, eradication, 4, surface accommodation, and 5, tokenism. So with denial, we can see that there has been a denial of a yogic practice and where it comes from. So there's not an acknowledgement of the 5,000-year history, or the sages or scholars or yogis who have been practicing this from South Asia and India. There's a denial that it comes from a history and a lineage. And often yoga is seen as something new age when actually it's really, really old school. And this also ties into destruction. So destruction of the traditional ways it was practiced or shared or taught, if that's a model that people believe in as well. A destruction also of the connection of the people who are from the land where yoga from a Vedic, Hindu, and Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh teachings come from, and that severing between people and cultural and spiritual practice is also a form of destruction. And that also ties into eradication as well. So erasing the history, erasing the violence that was associated with taking, eradication of people as well, so that people who have been practicing for so long or who don't fit into a white, skinny-bodied, cisgendered, like man-woman framing, that they are erased from the picture, or people who carry knowledge as well. And then surface accommodation and tokenism, I think, come into play where there might often be 1 or 2 Indian folks that teach at a studio, or there might be someone who is considered a cultural ambassador for certain corporations that have brown skin or black skin. This can be tokenism if there isn't in-depth relationship building or honoring of all of the teachings and work that this person has had to do in order to share yoga in this time and place. So given these 5 stages of colonization that Tanis Nielsen has put out, we can also look at how that shows up in our own practice. And then that also can help us realize that perhaps in the Western world, in this context of a diluted capitalist way of practicing yoga, it's not actually preserving yoga. It's not continuing a lineage of yoga. South Asian folks and Indian folks don't need other people to do the preserving for them. We have over centuries, and even with colonization and colonizer suppression, survived and had resilience and allowed for our medicine and spiritual traditions to continue and grow. So it's not changing it to fit a modern world. By doing so, it harms our own beings and each other's beings. While we cannot completely abolish cultural appropriation, and while we live in a colonized world, there are still ways and strategies that we can implement into our own practice, our own yogic practices, to address cultural appropriation. So these are strategies, not necessarily solutions, but here they are. Let's start with humbleness and humility. This is really important in a yogic practice in general, but if we enter into our practice aware that our egos want to flare up, they want to present and perform what it is to be a yogic practitioner, and we can return to a humbleness, it allows us to go deeper into the practice, but also might create a space that's more welcoming for other people. So even if you do know something and your experience allows you to know this something, there's a lot that you don't know. So always entering into our practice and sharing of practice with humility and humbleness. This also comes into acknowledging where the practices come from. You aren't the person who thought of them. Just because you read a book or studied for 6 months, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years does not make you the expert. And you don't necessarily, you aren't the only one who has done this. So just acknowledging the teachers who have come your way, and also who they learned from and who they learned from, which will ultimately bring you back to the Indian subcontinent. Acknowledgement of the aspect of yoga that you are sharing, and the aspects of yoga that you aren't sharing, and perhaps the aspects of yoga that you don't know about because our system has not given access to that. So if you're sharing a yoga practice that is based on physical postures and asanas, acknowledge that that's what you're doing, and that actually it is a whole system that goes far beyond just the physical practice. I think also it's important to recognize the space that one takes and the impact it has on other people. So when I walk into a room, I try to be aware of who else is in the space and what power and privileges I might have, in addition to ways that I might be marginalized in other ways. And also how my being can make other people feel. So if you have a space that is predominantly has white yogis practicing, start to think about why there aren't more folks of color, or perhaps if there's only skinny people, think about why there aren't bigger bodies in this space. And again, why there might be only one or two genders versus like the spectrum of genders in the space. And try to recognize the impact that you as a being have on other people and how you might need to move over to make space for other people. This also ties into tokenizing, and to avoid that, to really building in-depth relationships with brown people, black people, people of color, indigenous people, people of different genders, people of different body shapes and sizes, and really avoiding having a symbolized person or token. And this can be done through real relationship building. Also starting to acknowledge where sacred objects come from in this space. So perhaps there are scriptures around, perhaps there are statues of Buddha or Saraswati or any kind of sacred object, crystals, anything that might be used in healing practices or spiritual practices. Acknowledge where they come from. And if you don't know, then you don't know, but you have to be humble enough to address that you don't know. And also, if it is in the space, somebody in the space should be able to speak to its meaning and why it's there. And last but not least, Sanskrit and using sacred text and languages. Sound can be really healing to be brought into a yogic practice. However, when we are speaking Sanskrit, we should let people know that one, it's going to be said, and two, what it means. And also, if your pronunciation isn't great, know that you are altering the meaning of what you are saying, and actually it could be more harmful and painful for people who may have had severed knowledge to our traditional languages. And hearing a butchered version of Sanskrit actually can be counter to a yogic practice and healing for all people in the space. So for folks who are encountering this kind of discussion for the first time and are interested in addressing cultural appropriation and colonization in our practices, I thank you for listening to this video and watching this video. And I also hope that you continue this journey and really examine how you in your own personal life and practice can use strategies to counter cultural appropriation. It's not easy. It can often be discomforting. It might be challenging, but that's a part of the process that we all must go through to make our world more equitable and allow for healing, not just for our individual beings, but for ourselves as interconnected beings too. In the spirit of wanting to acknowledge where teachings come from and the people who have been doing this work, I would like to just give a moment to thank all the people who I know of who have been doing this work around sharing yogic medicine in holistic ways, as well as addressing cultural appropriation, whether they name it as such or not. Bibi Rahim, Heather Greaves, Sheila Bhattacharya, Sairupa Krishnamurthy, Anne-Marie Hood, who founded Brown Girls Yoga, Kim Katrin Crosby and Jamila Malik, 6 Degrees Acupuncture, and folks I know in New York, Yeshna Maya and Third Root Community Health Center. In Oakland, Sakura, who runs the POC Yoga Space. Also, Sapya in New York, South Asian American Perspectives on Yoga, who have lots of resources and are sharing tons about cultural appropriation and race dynamics in yoga. Decolonizing Yoga. as well as the Healing Justice Network that has grown out of the Allied Media Conference, and as well all the many, many organizations and communities and practitioners who are continuously working hard to share yogic medicine in holistic ways and as well make healing more accessible. I thank you so very much for all your work.